On February 24, 2026, nearly 4 decades after a jury first sentenced him to die, the state of Florida carried out the execution of Melvin Trotter at Florida State Prison. He was 65 years old. His death by lethal injection marked the end of one of the longest-running death penalty cases in the state's history, a case that began in the summer of 1986 with the killing of a 70-year-old shopkeeper inside her own neighborhood grocery store. In this video, we're going to walk through everything: the crime itself, the investigation, the trial, the decades of appeals, and finally, the events of his last day, including what he ate for his final meal and what happened inside the execution chamber. To understand how this case unfolded, we have to go back to June of 1986. The United States was deep in the grip of the crack cocaine epidemic. Entire communities were being reshaped by addiction, poverty, and crime. In Palmetto, Florida, a small and tight-knit community, people knew each other by name. Among them was 25-year-old Melvin Trotter. He had no formal education and had spent much of his life on the streets. By his mid-20s, he already had a criminal record for minor thefts and petty offenses. He was known locally as someone struggling with drug addiction, often committing small crimes to support his habit. On June 16, 1986, Trotter walked into a small grocery store that had served the Palmetto community for over 3 decades. The store was owned by V. Langford, a 70-year-old woman who had recently been widowed. She and her late husband had built the business from the ground up, and even after his passing, she continued to run it herself. Her children were grown, and the store was not just her livelihood, it was her life. She was known in the neighborhood as kind but firm, someone who had watched generations grow up through the aisles of her shop. Trotter knew the store well. It was a place frequented by local workers and families, and he had been there many times before. According to later testimony, his intention that day was simple: get money quickly so he could buy more drugs. Once inside, he began discreetly taking items of value, slipping them into his sweater so he could sell them later. It was not the first time he had stolen from that store. V. Langford had noticed before. She knew who he was. In fact, she had practically watched him grow up. On earlier occasions, she had chosen not to confront him directly, perhaps out of sympathy, perhaps out of hope that he would change. But that day was different. As Trotter moved through the store, he was in the meat section arranging products. She called out to him and asked him to come over. She confronted him about the thefts. She told him she knew what he had been doing, and she warned him that if he returned again, she would call the police. What happened next would forever change the community. According to the prosecution's case, Trotter, possibly under the influence of drugs and reacting impulsively, grabbed a butcher knife from within the store. In a sudden and violent confrontation, he attacked the elderly shopkeeper. The assault was brutal and swift. He stabbed her multiple times in the abdomen, causing catastrophic injuries. The violence of the attack shocked even seasoned investigators. Despite the severity of her wounds, V. Langford remained conscious for some time. She lay on the floor of her store, bleeding heavily. After the attack, Trotter turned his attention to the cash register. He took approximately $100 in cash along with food stamps, then fled the scene. Shortly afterward, a truck driver entered the store and found Mrs. Langford lying on the floor at the back of the building. She was still alive. In an extraordinary act of strength and clarity, she was able to speak to the witness and later to responding officers. She said she had known the person responsible for years. She described him as a short African-American man and mentioned that he wore a Tropicana Company employee identification badge with the name Melvin. Not long after giving that description, she lost consciousness. She was rushed to a nearby hospital and underwent emergency surgery. Doctors fought to save her life. For hours, she remained alive, but the damage was too severe. She ultimately died from cardiac arrest following the surgery. Her death sent shockwaves through Palmetto. A woman who had spent decades serving her community had been killed in her own store. Meanwhile, Trotter did not leave the city. According to witness statements, he sought out drugs almost immediately after the crime. Several acquaintances later told police they had seen him smoking crack, using money and food stamps that were wrapped in a red bandana. Investigators quickly traced the name provided by the victim to a nearby plant where Trotter worked. They confirmed his identity and began building their case. The evidence against him mounted quickly. Detectives recovered a palm print inside the store that matched Trotter. They found clothing with bloodstains consistent with the victim's injuries. Witnesses placed him in possession of cash and food stamps shortly after the attack. Within days, he was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and armed robbery. The trial began in 1987. Prosecutors described the crime as an especially violent act committed against a vulnerable, elderly victim who had shown compassion in the past. They emphasized the brutality of the stabbing and the fact that it occurred during a robbery. The defense, on the other hand, painted a picture of a deeply troubled man. They presented evidence of a childhood marked by abuse and abandonment. They argued that Trotter had a low IQ and had long struggled with severe drug addiction. They contended that he acted impulsively and under the powerful grip of that addiction, rather than with calculated intent. Despite these arguments, the jury found him guilty. On May 18, 1987, he was sentenced to death. At just 25 years old, Melvin Trotter entered Florida's death row. What followed was nearly 40 years of legal battles. His attorneys filed appeal after appeal, challenging aspects of the trial, the sentencing, and procedural issues. In 1993, he was granted a new trial. For a time, it seemed possible that his death sentence might be overturned permanently. But after retrial proceedings, he was once again sentenced to death. Over the decades, Florida's use of the death penalty fluctuated. There were periods when governors signed execution warrants regularly, and other times when execution slowed dramatically. Legal standards evolved. Court decisions at both the state and federal levels reshaped aspects of capital punishment law. All of this contributed to the length of time Trotter remained on death row. By the mid-2020s, his case had become one of the oldest active death sentences in the state. On January 23, 2026, Governor Ron DeSantis signed Trotter's death warrant, scheduling his execution for February 24, 2026. The announcement came amid a period of increased executions in Florida. In 2025, the state had carried out 19 executions, the highest number in the nation that year. The governor indicated that the pace would continue. As the execution date approached, legal teams filed final appeals, but none were successful. Clemency was considered but ultimately denied. For the family of V. Longford, the date represented the closing of a chapter that had stretched across generations. For others, it reignited debate about the death penalty itself. On the morning of February 24, 2026, Melvin Trotter woke up at 5 a.m. for the last time. According to official reports, he showered and prepared for the day. He did not receive any visitors in his final hours. His last meal was served several hours before the scheduled execution. He requested a simple menu: fish, cornbread, cake, and a soft drink. There were no extravagant demands, no unusual requests. At 5:00 p.m., he was transferred within Florida State Prison to the area near the execution chamber. At 6 p.m., he was escorted into the chamber itself. He was secured to a gurney with leather straps. 2 intravenous lines were inserted into his arms. Behind a glass window, members of the execution team and medical personnel observed. Also present were journalists and members of V. Langford's family. Before the procedure began, Trotter was asked if he had any final words. For about 30 seconds, he remained silent. In the end, he declined to make a statement. The lethal injection process was then initiated. Witnesses reported slight movement for several minutes. At 6:20 p.m., a doctor pronounced him dead. After nearly 40 years on death row, the sentence imposed in 1987 had been carried out. Outside the prison, reactions were mixed. Some believed justice had finally been served for V. Longford and her family. Others questioned whether executing a man decades after his crime, at age 65, achieved anything meaningful. The case remains a stark reminder of how a single moment of violence can ripple outward for decades, affecting families, communities, and the justice system itself. It raises enduring questions about addiction, accountability, punishment, and mercy. Nearly 40 years separated the crime from the execution, yet for many connected to the case, the memories of June 16, 1986 never truly faded. Now the story has reached its legal conclusion. The execution carried out on February 24, 2026, closed one of Florida's longest-standing death row cases. Whether one sees it as justice fulfilled or a tragic end to a cycle that began in the chaos of the 1980s drug epidemic, it is a case that continues to provoke strong opinions. I want to know what you think. Was justice served after all these years? Or does the passage of time change how we should view punishment? Let me know your thoughts.